You can hear them outside the door. 7 women, their voices low and clinical, discussing your body like it's a transaction they're overseeing. The silk walls of this chamber glow golden in the lamplight, but they feel like a tomb closing around you. Your hands won't stop shaking. They've been painted with henna that's still drying, leaving rust-colored stains that look disturbingly like blood. The musicians 3 floors below are still playing celebration songs, but up here, the only sound is your breath coming too fast, too shallow. He'll arrive within the hour. The man 43 years your senior, whose face you've seen exactly once. And those 7 women outside, they're not leaving. They'll be here for everything that happens next. Before we go further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's incredible how a tragedy from centuries ago can reach from Istanbul to Sao Paulo to Tokyo, connecting us across time itself. This is Constantinople. The year is 1520. The Ottoman Empire has just welcomed a new sultan to the throne, Suleiman, who history will call magnificent. His reign is beginning with celebrations that last for weeks. Parades wind through streets lined with thousands of spectators. Gold coins are thrown to crowds. And at the center of these festivities is a wedding. The bride is the sultan's daughter. She's 15 years old. She's been raised inside the Imperial Harem's protected walls, educated in poetry and philosophy, dressed in jewels worth more than entire provinces. But tonight, all that protection evaporates. Tonight, she crosses a threshold into a room where her bloodline means nothing, where the power she was born with transforms into the very thing that will be used to destroy her. Before dawn, one of them would make a choice that would be whispered about for decades. A physician's report, written at sunrise, would describe injuries so severe that modern doctors refuse to discuss the details publicly. And the girl who entered that chamber would never exist again. Her name was Mihrimah Sultan. That name meant sun and moon in Persian. Her father had chosen it himself when she was born, declaring she would be as beautiful as both celestial bodies combined. Now, it meant nothing. The marriage had been arranged 3 months earlier. Mihrimah had done something princesses never did. She threw herself at her father's feet in the throne room and begged him to reconsider. Court records describe witnesses being shocked into silence. A princess kneeling violated every protocol of imperial dignity. Suleiman looked at his favorite daughter with genuine sorrow in his eyes, but his answer never wavered. The wedding would proceed as planned. The groom was Rustam Pasha. At 58 years old, he was the Sultan's most brilliant administrator, ruthless, calculating, utterly without mercy. Smallpox scars created valleys across his face that servants said looked like dried riverbeds. He'd risen from nothing through pure ambition, and that was exactly why he'd been chosen. Because here's what made Ottoman royal marriages different. Ottoman princesses could never marry royalty. Ottoman law explicitly forbade it. They couldn't marry foreign princes or nobles with their own dynastic claims. They could only marry the Sultan's servants, grand viziers, military commanders, provincial governors. This created something psychologically devastating. Women raised as near-divine figures were legally transferred to men who were technically their social inferiors. And those men understood perfectly what was expected of them on the wedding night. It wasn't about building a partnership. It was about breaking their will completely. The wedding procession began at sunset. Torchlight wound through Constantinople's streets for 3 hours. Thousands lined the roads, celebrating what they believed was imperial magnificence. Mihrimah sat inside a closed palanquin, weighted down by layers of embroidered silk and jewelry so heavy she could barely hold her head upright. Multiple veils hid her face, not for modesty, but to conceal any expression of terror that might shame her family. When the palanquin finally stopped, the doors opened. The crowds cheered. And Mihrimah stepped down onto marble steps that led to a house she'd never seen before. The public ceremony continued for another hour. Blessings from religious scholars. Gifts presented on golden trays. More music, more celebration, more wine flowing freely for everyone except the bride. Then the doors to the bridal mansion closed. The crowds dispersed, and 7 women took their positions. They were called the verification matrons. Palace records describe their role with chilling precision. They would remain inside the bridal chamber or directly outside its doors throughout the entire night. They would listen. They would judge timing and sounds. They would wait for evidence that the marriage had been properly consummated. Most importantly, they would inspect the bedsheets at dawn for virgin blood. If there wasn't enough blood, if the evidence seemed insufficient, these women were authorized to enter during the act itself. They could physically examine the princess. They could restrain her if she resisted. This wasn't some shameful secret practice, it was standard imperial protocol written into law. But the witnesses were only the beginning of what made these nights so horrifying. Ottoman marriage protocols included something called turbi. The word translates roughly as discipline, education, training. In practice, it meant the husband was encouraged to establish absolute dominance on the wedding night, to make the power transfer unmistakable. European ambassadors stationed in Constantinople sent letters home describing what they heard during royal weddings. One Venetian diplomat wrote in 1545 that the sounds coming from a princess's wedding mansion were so violent that neighbors believed a murder was occurring. Some nearly called the janissaries to intervene. No one did, because everyone understood this was not only legal, it was expected. The most detailed accounts come from women who spent decades in the imperial harem before gaining freedom and returning to Europe. Their testimonies survived in convent archives and private letters. One account describes a common practice. The husband would remain fully clothed while forcing the princess to strip completely and remain naked for hours before any physical contact occurred. This wasn't about desire. It was about creating vulnerability, establishing psychological dominance before their bodies were ever touched. Another testimony describes princesses being denied food and water until they demonstrated what husbands considered appropriate submission: kneeling, kissing feet, tase, performing ritualized acts of servitude. Court religious scholars actually reinforced this approach in official guidance written specifically for husbands of princesses. One text from 1538 instructed, "Though she is born of imperial blood, in the marriage bed, you are her emperor. If she shows pride, humble it. She resists, break that resistance completely." The word break appears 17 times in that document. Palace medical records show physicians were frequently summoned the morning after royal weddings. Their reports describe injuries that go far beyond what would result from a typical first sexual experience. Severe vaginal tearing requiring stitches, hemorrhaging that continued for days. Internal injuries that prevented some princesses from walking for weeks. One physician's report from 1551 describes examining a 16-year-old princess married the previous night. He documents extensive internal damage, a state of psychological shock so severe she couldn't speak, bruising across her body, her arms, her throat, her back that suggested force well beyond what consummation required. When the physician asked the attending matrons how such injuries occurred, they replied simply that the husband had been particularly thorough in establishing his rights. That phrase appears repeatedly in these documents. Establishing his rights. It encapsulates the entire philosophy underlying these wedding nights. The princess's body wasn't hers. It was property being transferred from father to husband. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was the role mothers played. Women who'd endured these same terrors themselves were tasked with preparing their daughters for the inevitable. They couldn't stop the marriages. They couldn't change the rules. All they could do was teach survival. The advice they gave was devastatingly practical. Don't resist, because resistance prolongs the suffering. Don't cry loudly, because tears might insult your husband's honor. Make your body as soft as possible, even though every instinct screams to fight. Pray silently. Remember that surviving the first night means the nights afterward might be less brutal. This wasn't wisdom born of love. It was tactical instruction for enduring trauma. 3 days after her wedding, Mihrimah Sultan attempted to end her life. She drank concentrated opium mixed with wine in quantities that should have been instantly fatal. A servant found her collapsed, barely breathing. Palace physicians worked for hours to save her, forcing her to vomit, keeping her conscious until the immediate danger passed. When Sultan Suleiman learned what happened, he rushed to his daughter's side. But his response wasn't compassion for whatever had driven his beloved daughter to choose death. It was rage at the threat to imperial honor. He ordered complete silence about the incident. Anyone who spoke of it outside the palace would face execution. The official story became that the princess had fallen ill from wedding exhaustion. Court records were altered. The physicians who treated her were reassigned to distant provinces within the week. Mihrimah survived, but letters she wrote years later reveal she never recovered from that first night. In one letter written in 1534, 14 years after her weddings, she described her husband approaching her chambers each evening. Even after all those years, her body still betrayed her with uncontrollable shaking. She'd learned to separate her consciousness from her physical form, to float somewhere above her own body, while it endured what it had to endure. She prayed repeatedly to become pregnant quickly, not from any maternal desire, but because Islamic purity laws forbade sexual relations for 40 days after childbirth. For many Ottoman princesses, those 40-day periods were the only respite they ever knew. Mihrimah's experience wasn't unique. It was the standard reality for virtually every princess born into the Ottoman dynasty across 4 centuries. Aik Sultan, married at 14 in 1562, left behind a secret diary discovered during renovations in the 1890s. Her entries from the first year of marriage are almost unbearable to read. She described pain so intense she bit through pillows to avoid screaming. She wrote about her husband being tender in public, then transforming into someone unrecognizable once they were alone. One entry stands out. "Today, I turned 15. Mother sent almond cake, my favorite from childhood. I could not eat it. The smell reminded me of happiness I can no longer feel." She had that diary for 7 months before her husband discovered it during a search of her chambers. Aik never wrote again. The diary survived only because a servant secretly kept it after Aik died in childbirth at 17. 3 pregnancies in 3 years. Her body couldn't sustain a 4th. This system wasn't hidden or shameful from the Ottoman perspective. 'Twas open, legal, justified through convenient religious interpretation and political necessity. What made it especially insidious was that it offered princesses only one possible escape: becoming enforcers of the same system. If a princess survived her husband's death and had borne a son, she could eventually wield influence through her son's rise. She might arrange marriages for the next generation, and many chose that path. They became the matrons who witnessed their daughters-in-law's wedding nights. They became mothers preparing their own daughters for the same fate. Not because they were cruel, but because it was the only form of power available. The system endured for centuries. It survived political upheavals. It survived military defeats. It survived reforms that touched every other aspect of Ottoman governance. Accused. Only in the late 19th century did it begin shifting as the empire attempted European-style modernization. Even then, change came slowly, fiercely resisted. The mansions where these wedding nights occurred still stand in Istanbul today. Many are museums now, government offices, cultural centers. Tourists walk through their halls admiring Ottoman architecture, photographing intricate tilework and marble fountains. Most never realize what happened in those upper chambers. There are no plaques for these princesses, no monuments to their suffering. Ottoman history celebrates conquering sultans and military victories. When princesses appear at all, they're footnotes in genealogies. Born this year, married to this official, died on this date. Everything between the repeated nights of terror, the slow psychological destruction is erased from records preserving imperial glory. But one document survived that captures everything. Mihrimah Sultan lived until 1578. She spent 58 years carrying the weight of that first night. Near the end of her life, she wrote one final letter to a young niece facing arranged marriage. The letter was discovered in palace archives in 1923. In it, Mihrimah's niece had asked how she'd survived her wedding night, how she'd continued living afterward. Mihrimah's answer was devastating in its honesty. She wrote that the girl who entered the bridal chamber didn't survive. That girl died that night. What emerged at dawn was something else, something that learned to walk and speak and smile when expected. Something that could fulfill every duty required of an Ottoman princess. But something that never felt whole again. You're back where we started. Standing in a gilded chamber where silk walls glow golden in lamplight. 7 women wait outside, discussing protocols in clinical voices. Musicians 3 floors below play celebration songs that sound like mourning when you really listen. But now you know why. Now you understand that this moment, repeated thousands of times across 4 centuries, wasn't about creating families or building alliances. It was about breaking something that couldn't be allowed to exist. The idea that privilege or education could protect a woman from male power when that power had legal authority and social approval. The mansions still stand. The records still exist, filed away in archives where most people never look. And if you walk through Istanbul's museums today, through those empty upper chambers where tourists admire the view from ancient windows, you might notice something. The walls are very thick, built to contain sound, to keep certain screams from reaching the streets below, where crowds celebrated imperial magnificence, never knowing what that magnificence actually cost.